Welcome back, everyone. Today is one of the harder videos for me to share, because today we're exploring what it's like to violate personal minimums while making very questionable decisions. I would venture to say that most pilots end up crossing the line of being uncomfortable at some point in their journey, but this counts as the only time I've ever felt truly scared in an airplane. And I want to acknowledge up front that one of my most viewed videos was during my IFR training and highlighted at that time just how much further I had to go in my aviation journey. I spent quite a bit of time finishing that training and working to improve in terms of competence and proficiency, and not just being legal to fly. Now, please note, the flight we're looking at today occurred nearly 2 years after that other video, with almost 200 flight hours in between. I'm fully aware of the unintended implications of releasing so many videos showing where I lack skills, but these videos shouldn't be assumed to exist in a vacuum, and maybe someone will have a positive takeaway from my scare. So let's get into story time and join the flight, which is already airborne. Now, if you've been watching any of my other flying videos, you may already know that I went down to Arlington, Texas from Chicago in April for the Cessna Advanced Aircraft Club's recurrent training event. That was my longest solo flight, it was my longest IFR flight, and it was also my flight with the most time in actual IMC. And if you watch that video, you might notice that while not perfect, everything was under control and mostly routine. IFR training kicked in and the flight went just like it should. I expanded my comfort communicating with ATC. I expanded my understanding of how the plane reacts to different weather conditions. I'm ticking over enough hours where I'm in that proverbial ahead of the airplane on a more constant basis and starting to take notice of more and more around me. In a sense, I am gaining some of the adaptations and abilities where I can slowly start expanding my personal limits. The flight home was one that ended up being in flux for a little while, with good and bad decisions being made simultaneously. I had arrived on Thursday afternoon ahead of the training sessions, and those ran Friday and Saturday. Training wrapped up early in the afternoon on Saturday, but I was on the fence about leaving that evening. On one hand, I wanted to save the expense of a hotel for another night. There was that pressure to get home, but because I had met a friend who now lives in the area for a late lunch, my afternoon extended into the evening, and I decided to do the safer thing and not fly home and stay at the hotel for the evening. It's a common type of scenario that CFIs and DPEs will give you in an effort to evaluate your risk assessment of a situation. But we'll see in a minute why it's not always that cut and dry. My thought was that the safer route was to stay, to fly when better rested. Beside that, Saturday had several training flights cut short because the winds were quite intense, sustained around 25 knots and gusting well over 35 at times. I guess the winds are just one more thing they do bigger in Texas. I ended up choosing to stay the night and spent the evening flight planning my return. During this time, I looked at the usual NOTAMs, forecasts, winds, the TFRs, etc., and saw that there was a cold weather system with thick clouds approaching Chicago around 1 p.m. local time on Sunday. This meant that if I planned for a 5-hour trip, I had to be off the ground no later than 8 a.m. Wasn't really going to be a big deal. I'm kind of an early morning guy, not so much a night owl, so it should be fine. So now it was just a relaxed evening for me to pack up and get some rest. And when we pick up on Sunday morning, woke up at my usual 5:15, skipped my coffee to give my nonstop flight its best chances of not needing a pit stop, and then I opened my iPad to update my flight briefing. Well, that cold weather system is no longer forecast to land around 1. It's now been advanced by 2 hours, which means if I'm not wheels up by 6:30, I may very well be flying into a sub-zero cloud. And while ice is not currently in the forecast, in those conditions, I'm well aware it can't be ruled out. Well, I guess it's time to open my rideshare apps and find a ride back to the FBO, except that at 5 a.m., there's no drivers in the area. This could have served as strike one against flying for the day, but I wrote that off because I thought I was just being lazy, as my hotel was essentially at the end of the runway, so it was only a 10-minute walk to the FBO, and it'd be fine. When I got to the FBO, which is open 24 hours, that really only means to field side traffic, not necessarily to those of us arriving from the public domain. Might have been a little bit on the shady side, but I knew one of the gate codes, so I was able to get on the field, stash my bags in the plane, and then head over to the FBO to find someone to top up my fuel and get me on my way. I probably should have done this step the evening before, but that was when I had initially planned on departing 2 hours later and the FBO would have been open. Once I was all fueled up, it was a quick call to approach to get my clearance, and then I was on my way. Wheels up at 6:22 a.m. So far, so good. Got to experience the sunrise that was just outside the camera's view earlier in the video, too. As the flight progressed, it became a bit of a slog. I came down from Chicago with a headwind the entire way. So, as Mother Nature's wont to do, she gave me a headwind the entire way back as well, especially knowing I wanted to get ahead of that icing potential. To make matters worse, getting up to the more efficient altitudes came with even worse headwinds, so I stopped at 17,000. Luckily, this was more comfortable with the oxygen, as I only needed a cannula instead of a mask. As we continued, I was obsessing over the weather, getting very much in my head about what I wanted to do in any given scenario. At 17,000, I was well above the tops and kept seeing openings along the way too, but it was always in my head that if the openings stopped coming, I would have to get down through them. One thing to note, if you haven't watched my other videos, is that my plane is not equipped with any de-icing systems, whether incidental or Fiki. There are two very simple steps when dealing with ice in this type of plane, and the first one, very correctly, is to avoid if at all possible, but if encountered, GTFO. About 150 miles from my destination, I heard a Piper Arrow tell ATC they're starting to pick up some light rime ice and would like to go from 10,000 to 12,000. Followed up by a report that they were clear at that altitude. This triggered my brain to say, well, if they're getting light ice, maybe I should try and get down below it now before it gets any worse. I'm headed north, and that means colder. But then I noticed that the Piper on my traffic screen is also headed north. And since I'm not aware of any de-ice capability on that plane, they must know something I don't. Or so I convinced myself. And if I'm honest, this is where I changed from having questionable decisions to bad decisions and started down that path of aeronautical decision making, which should be questioned. Here is where I should have been looking for an actual hole to descend through. The bases were reported at 5,000 here, plenty of space to safely fly in the warmer air closer to the ground, with escapes in sight. And here's where I should have started looking at diversion options. But also here is where I ended up convincing myself that since that Piper was headed in the same general direction, that I would be fine a bit longer. A few minutes later, I went over some clouds where I could just barely see through to the ground. So visible moisture was certainly there, but thin enough that it felt lower risk to try and get through now. So I asked ATC if I could begin my descent based on the previous icing reports and attempt to get below the bases. They approved my descent at pilot's discretion down to 7,000. Now there's two things to notice right here. One, that Piper was at 12,000. I'm already entering clouds at 14, so I really hope that guy is okay. And just in case I blew past it too quickly, do we remember what I said a moment ago the bases were? Yep, they were at 5,000, and that means that I am being asked to hold level 8,000 in a cloud at minus 3C. To say I tensed up a bit is a little bit of an understatement. But as I leveled off at 8,000 through the cloud, nothing. Not a fleck or speck or shimmer of ice. Didn't really ease my mind, but it did distract me from the instrument scan I was supposed to be doing. In that moment, it made my life entirely reliant on the autopilot. I was subsequently cleared down to 5,000, and as I continued my descent, my luck on the ice began to run out. I'm about 50 miles from home with quite a bit of get-there-itis now. I've already put myself inside of a cloud in what are no longer just possible icing conditions, but actual accumulation of light ice. Now I'm convincing myself it'll be okay, because at this point, it has to be. I'm now Schrodinger's pilot, both alive and dead to the outside world until I emerge from that cloud. Oh yeah, and those bases at 5,000? That's changed too. I reported picking up light icing and was cleared to 4,000, and when I didn't break out there, I may have stretched the truth in reporting how rapidly I was accumulating ice. And I did this for two reasons. One was because I very genuinely had never experienced ice before, so knowing what the actual rate of accumulation was now more of an academic exercise I didn't want to focus on. And two, I wanted to get out of it. So conveying my sense of urgency to ATC got me cleared to 3,000, which had two very important aspects to it. Now I'm realizing there's a lot of two-item lists in this story. So be it. Anyway, 3,000 was the MVA, or the minimum vectoring altitude, and that's the lowest ATC can give me on the IFR plan. But more importantly, number 2 is that it was the actual basis. Interestingly, the very second I hit 3,000, I watched the ice slide right off the leading edge of the wing. And in hindsight, it had barely accumulated even 1/8 of an inch along that leading edge. Mind you, this is too much ice, as any ice is too much for a plane with zero ability to help it shed, but at 175 knots, it had not affected my indicated airspeed nor my controllability to this point. But I wasn't really out of the woods yet. I'm still 40 miles from home, and now I'm at the MVA in what have obviously been ceilings that are getting lower. But I can see the ground, and I continue down that bad path of convincing myself that because I can see the ground, I can make it to my destination. I'm also low enough now that I have data signal for my phone and iPad, which means I get more detailed updates of the forecast beyond just the ADS-B weather. And the TAFs for O'Hare show improvement within the hour, so now I'm convincing myself even further that I'm through the worst and it's going to get better. However, as I cruise along the bottom of the cloud, it very much does not get better for a while. At 3,000, I continue in and out of clouds, accumulating and then shedding ice. Never more accumulation than that initial 1/8 inch or so. But at this point, I don't know if the bases will stay here. Also during this time, there's about a 5-minute silence on the radio, and around O'Hare, that's kind of bizarre. Doesn't matter the time of day, it's usually nonstop chatter. But I'm also still on frequency with center, so I made sure to queue up and query ATC with whether or not I could still be heard, because that silence is genuinely bizarre. Now, the controller was impressively perceptive on the situation and sensed the stress in my voice. Handed me over to approach where I would have plenty of chatter to make sure I hadn't lost communications, and where the transmitter would be potentially less susceptible to any P-static. Now, as I'm flying in and out of the cloud bases, I tried to cheat my way down a little bit in altitude, setting my autopilot about 80 to 100 feet low, close enough to my assigned altitude that I wouldn't get scolded, but trying to get every advantage I could to stay out of the clouds and grabbing back any of the inches towards warmer air. Thankfully, and finally, I'm handed off to 120.55, which is a blessing of a frequency for me because it's my final frequency before tower. Equally relieving is that I see the outside air temperature tick up another degree into positive territory, and I see larger and larger gaps in the clouds. Large enough that I'm even offered the option of a visual approach back into executive. But at this point, even though there might be less stress doing a visual approach, I'm already configured for the RNAV, and I don't want to change too many variables at the last minute. Now, there are some of you out there that are watching this and thinking I'm being a bit dramatic here. 1/8 inch of ice is no big deal. For others of you, you may be thinking like I do, that I got incredibly lucky. One of my biggest takeaways from this experience is that the training scenarios that get tossed at you by CFIs and DPEs does work to examine your decision-making process. But, and it's a big but, those scenarios are never going to be as clean-cut in the real world as they're presented in training. In this case, and with the benefit of hindsight, I would have been better off leaving Saturday night with 0 IMC, or staying an additional day into Monday and just taking some more PTO. But I took off not fully rested. I flew trying to get ahead of a weather system that I knew was approaching. I failed to get my plane refueled the night before and plan more explicitly my departure procedures with the FBO. I had several flags raised that I should have diverted or made a course correction or even stayed that extra day. I ended up breaking several of my personal minimums on weather, on conditions, on time, on fatigue, on assessing my own abilities. And yes, I learned a lot about what the plane can handle in terms of ice, but that's not a situation I want to find myself in again anytime soon, or ever. I even think back and wonder, if I had one of the non-Fiki de-ice systems installed, would that have made me even more overconfident and potentially caused additional issues? Or would it have been fewer of them, but with more severe consequences? On one hand, I'm happy to have learned a lot about myself. I learned about my abilities, and on some level, the lack thereof. I learned a bit about how I react to stressful situations in an airplane. And much like my flight down to Texas just a few days prior, I'm happy that I mostly reverted to my training. But I'm very disappointed I nearly got emotionally overwhelmed. Solo. My personal minimums may have expanded in terms of what I feel comfortable with as it relates to ceilings, but I also think I've tightened them up with what I can accept in terms of temperature compared against clouds and IMC at certain times of year and with the equipment I have. Now, I'm not scared to get back in the air. In fact, I've been up several times since this flight, and I continue to remain excited about expanding my aviation journey. But I think I'm going to start saving up to install at least a non-Fiki de-ice system for incidentals and use that time that it gets me to divert to somewhere I can wait it out or stay the night. And on that note, if you do feel like supporting my flying addiction and helping me snag a few pennies from the YouTube ads, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit those like and subscribe buttons down below, and I can share when I have good flights as well as when I have things I learn. Having a few extra eyes and incremental engagement with each video will encourage me to continue sharing the good, the bad, the fun, and the boring. And I encourage you to engage down below in meaningful ways. But if all you want to do is criticize my decisions, trust me, I've been doing enough of that for myself. But until next time, thanks for watching.